The Bible is a big book containing lots of memories. These memories were handed down from generation to generation. Firstly, the memories were handed on as oral stories within families and groups, and then they were written down by hand on scrolls and papyri and parchment. Nowadays they are printed onto paper by modern printing machines and bound into books such as this. Memories are powerful, but they are also mysterious. We can struggle to rely even on our own memories. We can struggle to remember what happened yesterday or even a few minutes ago. Often we need reminders or clues to bring back our own memories. Sometimes we need time and space by ourselves to reflect on what has happened and in that stillness to remember. A few years ago, my wife Liz and I spent a happy anniversary lunch remembering one event from each year that we had been married. I don't recall which of our anniversaries it was, but I remember that we were at the Tongue Hotel, so it would have been approaching 40 years that we were trying to remember. It was a pleasant exercise which I can recommend, but don't fall out over it. When the most important people in our lives pass on into the hereafter, we want to remember them. In a cemetery, we would place a headstone, giving their names and dates, and perhaps an epitaph too. Perhaps something like Spike Milligan's epitaph, "I told you I was ill." We don't just want to remember our sadness and grief at their death, but to remember all the happy and positive contributions that they made to our lives. Photos and memories, mementos, also help us to remember. Our war memorials contain lists of names and the military service, role and rank in which they served. These memorial lists help us to remember the people we knew and loved, who gave their lives to defend our country against those who were attacking us. As in our cemeteries, the memorials usually last longer than the people who remember those who have died. But perhaps some of their stories continue to be shared down through the generations, persisting long after the people who knew them have died. Such is the case with the Bible. The book of Genesis records the earliest, haziest memories of the beginnings of the Jewish people, with Abraham being the well-established founder of the Jewish faith and the Israelite people. We have a record of his ancestors, but we know very little about them. The book of Numbers contains a record of the early census of the Israelites after they escaped from slavery in Egypt about 3,500 years ago. Not only do we have listed the 12 sons of Jacob, who was renamed Israel by God, but we have lists of names and families and totals. There were at least 2 censuses during that time, and the later one counted everyone over 20 years of age, totaling 601,730 people. We don't have all of their names, but we have many of the family names. As the early church grew, they passed on to each new generation the stories of Jesus and his followers, his disciples. Jesus chose 12 of his disciples to be the first that he sent out in pairs to begin taking his message to the villages that he himself was heading towards. They became known collectively as the 12. Abraham's grandson Jacob had 12 sons who founded the 12 tribes of Israel, and perhaps that's why Jesus chose 12 of his closest disciples. The earliest written book of the New Testament is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. It was written about 53 AD, only 20 years or so after Jesus' execution on the cross and subsequent resurrection from the tomb on the 3rd day. Paul never met Jesus, but he lists Peter and the 12, and James, the brother of Jesus, as those who met with the risen Jesus after his resurrection from the grave. And Paul writes that on one occasion, Jesus met with a group of 500 people, most of whom were still alive at the time when Paul wrote. Today, on Remembrance Sunday, we remember those who gave their lives in 2 world wars and many other conflicts since then. We are grateful for their sacrifice. Our country was never occupied by the invading armies, although some of our cities in the south suffered tremendous damage from bombs and rockets. Eventually, the invading armies were defeated and peace was restored. But the cost was immense, in lives lost, in injuries suffered, in damage sustained, in the pain and hardship suffered by countless others who did not suffer physical injury or loss. In war, there are no victors. We see that in Ukraine today. Even if new boundaries were established on the current front lines and the conflict stopped, the damage on each side is immense. Around 100,000 soldiers killed on each side, tens of thousands of civilians killed by indiscriminate bombing and shelling, millions of people forced from their homes, and many of those homes destroyed. Power stations and bridges destroyed, and much other infrastructure too. There will be no winner whenever peace is eventually restored. Jesus came to bring God's peace and justice to the world. It can only be achieved if we love each other in our families, in our neighbourhoods and communities, and across the country. We need leaders who will lead with justice and integrity for the good of the people and not only for themselves. We need police and justice systems that we can trust and depend on to act according to the law with fairness and justice. If we all lived by the love of God, life would be so much better than the squabbling and bitterness that characterises much of our national life, even around the world. We remember the sacrifices of 2 world wars, not only to remember the people we have lost, but to warn and deter us from getting into that situation again. In Ukraine, we see that it is not so far away as we thought it was. The Church of Jesus Christ has the answer, but only if we live it in our lives and help others to see that it is the only way for the world to live at peace. It's impossible to live it on our own. Only with God's help in each of our lives by His Holy Spirit can we put into practice the way of life that Jesus showed to His disciples and followers. We have their stories. Let us make them into our stories too. Amen.